Hello all, welcome to this month's installment of Spotlight on the Collection. I'm Bailey Schluter, the director of the McLeod County Historic Partnership. This month March is Women's History Month, and I wanted to share with you a couple stories of significant women who played a critical role in McLeod County's history. Now, I don't have any cool artifacts with me, but all the photographs that I'll be showing are part of the collection at the county museum, and many of them are original. So if you want to do some research into these families, you can come visit the research library and see them for yourself. So let's get started with Helen Pendergast. Now, you might remember I talked a little bit about her last month. She married Lewis Harrington, who played a big part in the early days of Hutchinson. She lived in the Harrington Merrill House. That's on the National Register. But we didn't really talk much about her, and so I wanted to do that today. Ellen was born in 1836 in Durham, New Hampshire. She was the middle out of 5. Her mother passed away when Ellen was 12, and her father eventually remarried and fathered 2 or 3 more children. So she had a big family, but she was a very old family that she was a part of. She could trace her ancestry back to Stephen Pendergast, who settled in Durham on land that was issued from a grant from the King of England. So the Pendergasts were very old, very proud, but also very humble family. Ellen went to school. She got her up and grew up in New Hampshire. The first time she left home was in 1854 to teach in New Jersey. She lived there for a year and then returned home. But then she left again, this time for good. In the fall of 1855, she traveled with a brother and a sister to Milwaukee, where their other brother, William, whose name you might recognize, was already living. She eventually followed her brother William again to Hutchinson. Now, this is an interesting story. She went from Milwaukee to St. Paul and then to gather supplies for the new Hutchinson settlement. Now, Hutchinson was settled in 1855, so it's still very new. Minnesota is still a territory at this time. There aren't roads. There are barely trails that connect all of these small communities, so keep that in mind. But she and 14 other people took a boat from St. Paul to Henderson up the Minnesota River. Now, if you look at a map, the Minnesota River winds a lot. It's not a straight path, as rivers often aren't. It twirls, it swirls, it does its own thing. So a normal hour trip for us could take multiple hours, especially when you figure all the food, supplies, and luggage that these people had with them. But then from Henderson to Hutchinson, they walked the rest of the way. Now, it's about 42 miles by road in today's standards between these two towns. But again, there were no roads. There were barely walking paths between these communities. So can you just imagine these women in these full skirts and long-sleeved dresses and men and women carrying everything on their backs or by cart? If you wanted to settle somewhere, you really had to want to settle somewhere, because it was a lot of work to get yourself back home if you didn't like where you were. But she made it to Hutchinson without any problems, and she lived with her brother William until she met and married Lewis Harrington on December 5th, 1857. Their first home was in a little frame building on the northwest corner of what is now Washington and Main Street, so you can stand there. And the building's not there anymore, but you can still see what her perspective would have been. When Lewis unfortunately died in 1884, Ellen moved in with her daughter and son-in-law Martha in what is now commonly known as the Harrington Merrill House. So she didn't play a part in building the house, but that was her home for most of her life. But the real reason I wanted to talk about Ellen was her part in the 1862 Dakota War. Now, we don't have a lot of time to go into the Dakota War, but there were rogue bands of the Dakota Indians, that were going all over the state and, to put it simply, causing havoc, burning down towns, killing white settlers. And many people from Hutchinson wanted to flee. They wanted to run to St. Paul, Minneapolis, where it was safer, and just let Hutchinson burn. They were just going to leave it. But 3 women, Ellen, Julia Els, and Sarah Harrington, they quite literally put their foot down and said, no, this is our town. We need to save it. A paper had been drawn up to form a military company, just a small band of men who could defend their town. And these women took the paper all over, and they convinced enough men to form an army and to build a stockade to defend Hutchinson. When in September 4th, 1882, the town eventually was attacked. And Ellen, Julia, and Sarah, they didn't just convince the men to make the army. They were part of the army. They were gun runners or gun loaders, because at the time a gun was one shot. You had to reload it, so they would reload it. They were nurses to the wounded during and after the day-long battle. She was described later at her funeral by a good friend, and he said, in the time of the Dakota Uprising, when the inhabitants needed nerves of steel, this woman, Ellen, encouraged everyone with her own bravery, and whenever since there had been an occasion for courage, it was not lacking in her. And that's just incredible in a time where women couldn't do or weren't even considered to take on this role. She gave it to herself. And everyone wanted to run. They wanted to flee. They wanted to leave Hutchinson behind. And so we don't know what this community would have looked like, because buildings were burnt down. The Pendergast school that William Pendergast established burnt down. Churches were burnt down. Small homes in the more rural aspects of Hutchinson and the townships were burnt down. And so we don't know what this community would look like. We don't even know if it'd still be here without the bravery of Ellen, Julia, and Sarah. So it was awesome. Ellen lived the rest of her days in Hutchinson. When you're one of the town's first settlers and you live there the rest of your life, you kind of build up a reputation. And other Pendergasts, her father eventually settled in Hutchinson. Her brothers and sisters came to live. And so she had lots of family and her in-laws, the other Harringtons surrounding her. So she became known as Aunt Ellen around the community. Even those who weren't related to her referred to her as Aunt Ellen. She was deeply involved with her church. She was one of the original members of the Eastern Star and Rebecca Lodges. She was a huge part of her Methodist church, and she even taught Latin at Hutchinson High School. We have a photograph of her with the 1906 Hutchinson High graduating class, and you can see her standing there among the other students and teachers. There's another photograph that I love of a birthday party for Aunt Ellen that was in 1902. And sitting next to her, to our left, her right, is a man with a big white beard and long white hair. That's John Hutchinson. That's one of the men who founded this town, and I love that they stayed friends. She built this amazing community around herself, and she helped build this community, and it's just incredible. When she passed away on March 2nd, 1915, she was 79 years old. She had 2 children and 1 grandchild by that time, but a large amount of extended family. There were so many people that wanted to come to her funeral that they ran out of standing room. And the pastors of the church, the reverends of the church, actually had to turn people away or ask them to wait outside. It's like there wasn't enough room in the church for people who came not only from inside McLeod County, but from the surrounding area who came to celebrate her life. So thanks, Helen, for everything you did. The next and last woman that I want to talk about is Helen Baker, which I feel is rather relevant since the school named for her recently closed. But she lived a rather quiet life, but she played a very large part in the education of this community. Ellen was born on October 2nd, 1871 in New Auburn, Minnesota to Augustus Carver and Mary Todd Baker. She was the middle of 7 children. Now, Augustus, her father, moved the family to Brownton, Minnesota in 1878, and he built a home that Helen actually continued to live in for the rest of her life. She, throughout all her teaching, until she died, she remained in this Brownton home. So when you look her up, she taught in Glencoe, but she was from Brownton. So don't get the two mixed up. She attended elementary school in Brownton and graduated from Hutchinson High. After she graduated, she took her first teaching position at one of the rural schools in McLeod County. She had that position between 1891 and 1892 until she could earn enough money to go to the University of Minnesota. When she finished her schooling there, she received a special library training, which I think is interesting. But after she finished her education at the U of M, she came back and taught for Brownton between 1898 and 1904, teaching English and Latin. And then she transitioned out of the county. She left McLeod County for a small time, still living in Brownton, to be a principal for Montevideo High School. She held that position for 5 years before eventually returning to the Glencoe school system, where she continued to work for the rest of her career. She made that transition in 1909, first serving as a teacher. There was a large assembly room at Stevens Seminary. It was still Stevens Seminary at this time, that had multiple classes all in one. And so she taught English, ancient history, modern history, quote unquote modern history, and Latin. And she had a very strong presence. She was known to be strict, but still soft. There's a story, well, not soft, kind. There's a story. She hit a student on the hand with a ruler, like not very hard, but it still made a large impact on her. I think it affected her more than it affected the student. And after that moment, she never raised a hand to a student again. She was very purposeful about that. So she taught at Glencoe High School, and then she became the principal. She was the principal of Stevens Seminary, and when they made their transition to Glencoe High School. And then in 1941, she lessened her responsibilities just a little bit. She was still involved with the school. She still had a lot of power with the school, but instead of being the principal, she became the librarian. She was a librarian for the elementary school and the high school until 1957. So between 1909 and 1957, she worked for the Glencoe public school system, and in total, she worked for the Minnesota school system for 60 years. 60 years that she was a teacher and a principal and a librarian and an educator, and it's incredible. And that's 60 graduating classes. That's hundreds of students that she worked with, on top of tutoring her own nieces and nephews, because she had a large family and most of them had children, and they all lived and those nieces and nephews lived in the area, and so she would tutor them after school and on weekends, as well as teaching her own students and grading her own papers. But before her retirement, in 1953, she was honored at the Minnesota State Fair by the state of Minnesota for being the oldest teacher based on years of service and age. There was an article published about her in the Minneapolis Tribune, and in that article there was a really interesting photograph of Helen standing at the construction sites for a new elementary school that was going to be named Helen Baker. and the school opened before she retired. So she was working at Glencoe High School, and right down the road was the Helen Baker Elementary School, which I kind of find funny. I think that's interesting. But on top of being a dedicated educator, she was a lifetime member of the Parent Teachers Association, Delta Kappa Gamma sorority from the U of M. She was a member of the Sunrise chapter of the Order of the Eastern Star, based in Montevideo. She was involved with the Episcopal Church in Hutchinson, the Women's Fellowship of the Brown Congregational Church, so 2 churches, and the Hospital Auxiliary. And I think the impact of her service is perfectly demonstrated with one photograph, again from the Minneapolis Tribune article. It's Helen, you can see her standing on the right, talking to former students. The older man in the photograph is George Gould, who graduated from Stephen Seminary in 1911. And then his daughter, Mrs. Dawn Polfall, who graduated in 1936. And George is holding his granddaughter, little Paula, who is 5 years old and was going to start kindergarten soon at the Helen Baker School. So 3 generations of people that Helen had a direct or indirect influence over. And that was just a small glimpse of women's history in McLeod County. Thank you all. Next time I'll be here, I'm going to have a special guest with me, so tune in then. Thanks.